Ukrainian peace talks are underway in Florida, where the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, says he expects more progress towards a deal to bring an end to the war. Sky's defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, joins us now. Good to see you, Michael. Just having a look, and we have heard from Ukraine's first Deputy Foreign Minister in the last half an hour or so, saying it's been a good start to the ongoing meeting, very engaging, so far constructive, warm atmosphere, conducive to potential progressive outcomes. So certainly there seem to be good intentions at the start of this.
Yes, I mean, they've got to talk it up because the Ukrainians certainly don't want to look as if they are, as it were, dismissing the deal, which is very close to President Trump's heart. But the circle that's somehow got to be squared is that the Russians are only really keen on the 28-point peace plan that was drawn up in Miami a couple of weeks ago by Karol Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff. And the Russians have said that's the basis for some sort of peace treaty. And it's really a surrender document. And the Russians are sticking to that. And the Ukrainians, with the Europeans backing them, have come up with a 19-point plan, which they think they could maybe just about live with. And the Americans have got to try to reconcile if you like, the Ukrainian 19 points with the Russians' 28 points. And all the indications are that the 28 points are something that the Russians will not back away from. I mean, they might conceivably make some minor concessions, but I don't think there's much chance that they will come along with the version of the deal that then emerged last week, the 19 points that Ukraine can live with. So I suspect that though the Ukrainians are undoubtedly saying the right things while they're there in Washington, I'm fairly sure they're being lent on very, very hard by the Americans, because the Americans want to, as it were, take this moment of political weakness in Ukraine to make them sign something which in other circumstances I don't think they would even dream of signing.
And Michael, we saw the various characters around that table, didn't we, just ahead of those talks starting. I see that Ukraine's first Deputy Foreign Minister says great leadership from Marco Rubio. As in Geneva, I appreciate the attitude of Jared Kushner as he lays out a vision. And of course, the Ukrainians have lost their top negotiator because he's had to resign.
Yes, and I mean, they need Marco Rubio and Kushner are quite important to them because Rubio is more pro-Ukrainian, certainly than Steve Hegseth or Donald Trump himself, or most of the other people around Donald Trump. So Rubio is more sympathetic, and Kushner is quite a careful character. I mean, Kushner is quite subtle, and he's done a good job originally in the Middle East in the first Trump administration with the Abraham Accords. And I think the Ukrainians must be hoping that Rubio and Kushner can represent their interests better than Steve Witkoff was able to represent them and some of the other people nearer to Donald Trump. So the Ukrainians have got a very delicate job to do, and they're being led by Umarov, who's been in this business for a while. I mean, he's quite a clever character, and he's not come into this thing late. But the fact is, the Ukrainians are in a position of political weakness because Zelensky himself has got now to appoint a new chief of staff. And that there is a sense in which Zelensky, this is a moment of truth for him, that somehow he's got to refresh his government and re-legitimize it in the eyes of the Ukrainian people as well as in the eyes of the American delegation.
And of course, while the talks are ongoing, attacks continue overnight, and both sides here are making the point that they are prepared to continue.
Yes, and both sides need to show, both the other side and the Americans, that neither of them are beaten. The Russians are making the point that they will carry on regardless of however long it takes, and the Ukrainians are trying to make the point that they're not giving up, and that the Ukrainians themselves are not victims. Well, they are victims in the sense they've been attacked, but they're not, as it were, beaten. They've still got a lot that they can do. And overnight, I mean, the exchange of attacks, as it were, the Ukrainians were the more effective, actually, because they were able to launch a pretty big attack on Novorossiysk, which is the Russian port in the Russian part of the eastern Black Sea, and they damaged quite badly one of the oil loading terminals, which has affected some Kazakh ships that were due to load there. And so the Ukrainians are actually impeding Russia's export of oil, which is the most important thing they need to do. As I keep saying, it won't win them the war, but it'll put the Russian economy under greater pressure next year if the Russians are still fighting at the sort of current level with their energy infrastructure being constantly damaged by Ukrainian attacks.
What happens in all of this if Russia refuses to budge on its demands, or at least on most of its demands, and Ukraine is unhappy with that? I mean, could we ever get to a point where Ukraine is made to sign, and if they refuse, what happens then?
No, that's exactly the problem, Jonathan. I think we're going around this for the third time now. The first time we went round this particular circuit was in April. The second time was in August, and now we're going around exactly the same circuit now in November, December. And it's coming towards the critical point. Maybe we'll go around it a fourth time in the new year. Who knows? But we end up still back at where we started, which is that the Russians demand that the Ukrainians surrender. Now, if the Americans are prepared to push the Ukrainians to say, you've got to surrender, the Ukrainians will say no, and the Americans will then pull the rug from under Ukraine. They'll cease all aid, which is intelligence sharing and some help with targeting, and maybe they'll even stop the Europeans buying weapons on behalf of Ukraine, American weapons to give to them. So it's possible that the Americans could make life much more difficult for Ukraine. But all the indications are, rightly or wrongly, that the Ukrainians won't surrender. They won't give in. And if they have to carry on without American backing, so far they all say that they will. And that will make the war much more difficult for Ukraine over the winter and into next year. And it really then puts the onus on the Europeans to, put their money and their courage where their mouth is and show that they really will back up Ukraine when the chips are all down. Now, we hope it doesn't come to that. But it may do if the Americans end up putting a sort of surrender document on the table and say, sign it or else, the Ukrainians will walk away, regardless of the consequences for the war.